kind of cool. Now, John D. Filippi, the guy who lives in the apartment right above Jones, thought God's voice sounded kind of like a maitre d' he knew in a restaurant. So then Jones plays a tape for Vinny, who owns the bar on the corner, and his girlfriend Trish, and they don't believe it's the voice of God either. They both kind of think the voice kind of sounds like John D. Filippi. It doesn't sound anything like John D. Filippi, goes Jones. It doesn't matter, goes Banana Winograd. Because basically, if you got a recording of two people talking, one of whom may be you. And Vinny goes, see, exactly my point. That's exactly what I'm saying. And Jones goes, oh man, and he walks away. So now about 2 weeks later, sometimes Jones is practicing Foxy Lady on his electric guitar. And he's taping himself, and he runs out of tape. So he takes his God tape and records himself over, he records himself, you know, practicing Foxy Lady over his recording of him and the God talking. Now, if you listen to the tape real close, in this one part, for a couple of seconds, Jones sounds exactly like Hendrix. Yeah. I'd like to read two more. They're really short. They're just like nothing.
Go. Don't.
So this one's called, this is a fairy tale called Shit Happens. It's a very cautionary fairy tale. Once upon a time he lied to her and got her to come to his home, where he put her in a large mason jar and held her there against her will for 140 days and nights with nothing to eat but tapioca pudding and rocks. Except for Thursdays, when she got red rubies and delicious shepherd's pie that was always way too hot and never cooled down, no matter how hard or long she blew on it. On October 15th, while he was sitting in his favorite chair in front of his favorite window, skipping through a new screenplay his best friend had just finished, sipping brandy and watching the sun go down over the sea, she finally figured out how to get out of the mason jar, snuck upstairs with a shard of glass from the shattered jar, and from behind slit his sainted throat so swift and silent and deft he didn't even notice. Her joy was exceeding, no begging, no pleading, no fear of succeeding, no wanting, no needing. She just left him reading and silently bleeding, and ended up leading the funeral proceeding, and now he's just feeding the worms underground. Shit happens to him. Okay, this is Sometimes Jones and the Meaning of Life. Now, this is a story about how sometimes Jones was always saying the wrong thing, and how his friends was always saying to him, hey schmuck, what did you say that for? Or hey schmuck, why'd you say that? Or what are you, stupid or something? Why'd you say that? So finally, sometimes Jones got so tired of hearing people say, hey schmuck, what did you say that for? He decided to go to Tibet and find some Zen monks and find out what the meaning of life was, so he'd become enlightened and say wise things and help others. So he saved, and he finally borrowed, and he begged, and he stole, and he finally got up enough money to buy a round-trip plane ticket to Kathmandu with enough money left over to buy some mountain climbing gear and a Rosetta Stone CD so he could learn to speak perfect Castilian Kathmandanese. And he took off. As soon as he landed in Kathmandu, he asked everyone he saw in perfect Castilian Kathmandanese, where do the wisest Zen monks live? And everyone pointed to the same high, windswept, snow-covered mountain instead, in some weird Kathmandanese dialect. The wisest monks live up there. So sometimes Jones put on his gear and he climbed this rugged, cold, windswept mountain. And when he climbed about three-quarters of the way up and he couldn't take another step because his legs felt like lead, and he was exhausted and freezing, through the blizzard he sees these three old monks sitting on a ledge wearing nothing but light silken saffron robes, meditating. So with his last bit of strength he went over to them and he said, oh great monks, I have traveled far and suffered much to get here, to ask you, what is the meaning of life? And the first monk said, life is a fountain. And the second monk said, life is a tree. And the third monk said, life is a cloud. And sometimes Jones got it. He said, wow, that is so cool. That's exactly what I needed to know. I want to stay here and study where you guys studied so I can know what you guys know and be wise like you and say wise things. Where'd you guys learn that? And the three monks pointed up the freezing, windswept, snow-covered mountain, and there on the top was this huge black stone monastery. So sometimes Jones got his internal fortitude together and he painfully climbed the rest of the way to the top of the blizzard-driven, snow-covered mountain, collapsed in front of the big oak door, and his last bit of strength knocked as loud as he could. The door was opened by a very big monk in saffron robes who gently picked him up and carried sometimes Jones to the great Zen master. Sometimes Jones bowed before him and said, "Oh, great Zen master, I have traveled far and suffered much. May I please stay here and study with you?" And the great Zen master said, "Sure," in a very weird Kathmandanese dialect. So sometimes Jones put on a plain linen robe and studied hard at the monastery for the next 5 years. He learned how to meditate, and he learned focus and discipline, and how to stand outside naked in the freezing wind and snow and dry a wet sheet with just the heat of his body. And he spent another year learning to meditate while the Zen master beat his back with a bamboo stick. And he spent another whole year in complete silence. And then, after 5 years at the monastery, the great Zen master came to sometimes Jones and said, "You have studied and meditated well, and you are now my #1 student here. Remember those 3 monks who you approached when you first came here?" "Sure," said Jones. "Well," said the great Zen master, "one of them has shed this mortal coil and has gone to the next plane, and we need someone to replace him. And I have chosen you because you have great dedication and you have great knowledge." So sometimes Jones took his place next to the other 2 Zen monks on the ledge, and they spent their days in meditation and silence, until one day Jones saw a young man climbing up the mountain towards him, much as he had done 5 years before. And this young man stopped in front of sometimes Jones and the other 2 monks, and he said, "Oh, great monks, I have traveled far and suffered much and crossed the seas and climbed this mountain to ask you, what is the meaning of life?" And the first monk said, "Life is a bird." And the second monk said, "Life is an ocean." And sometimes Jones said, "Life is a boat." And the young man said, thank you very much. I can now go home and follow my bliss." And the young man turned and went back down the mountain. And as soon as the young man was out of sight, the 2 monks turned to sometimes Jones and said, "Hey, schmuck, what did you say that for?" I wrote that a couple of months ago, and it's my favorite story. But last night, I heard the epilogue. I heard the next minute and a half of conversations. After he said, "That's what," he said, "Hey, schmuck, what did you say that for?" And sometimes Jones said, "That's what they taught me." And one of the Zen monks said, "Who taught you that?" "The great Zen master." "The great Zen master told you life was a boat?" "Yeah." "Which Zen master?" "The great Zen master that heads the big black monastery up there." And one of the monks said, "Oh, that monastery. No, the one behind it."